I remember the first time I heard the name Lynette Dawson. It wasn't in a news report or a missing persons alert. It was years later, buried in whispers, tangled in unanswered questions, wrapped in the kind of mystery that refuses to fade. A wife, a mother, a woman who seemingly vanished into thin air. But people don't just disappear without a trace, do they? It was January 1982 when Lynette Joy Dawson was last seen alive. She was 33 years old, a devoted wife, a caring mother to two young daughters. By all accounts, her life wasn't one of extravagance or scandal. It was filled with the simple moments of family, of love, of routine. But one day, she was gone. No goodbyes, no warnings. Just gone. Her husband, Chris Dawson, a former professional rugby player turned high school teacher, had an explanation. She left, he said, walked away from her family, from her daughters, from her life. A voluntary disappearance. That's the story he told. And for years, that was the story that stood. But something about Lynette's disappearance never quite made sense. The timing, the circumstances, the way the people closest to her described her final days. And then there was the matter of the girl, the teenage student who had been living in the Dawson home even before Lynette was gone. Lynette never reported to work again. She never made the plans she said she would. She never contacted her family, the people she loved most. And for 6 whole weeks, her husband didn't even report her missing. The case would grow cold. The years would pass. And the world would move on, accepting the idea that perhaps Lynette had chosen to vanish. But choices leave trails. Choices leave evidence. And Lynette left nothing. Then, decades later, a podcast would bring her name back into the spotlight. A voice on the airwaves, telling a story that had been buried in silence. The world listened. Authorities reopened the case. And suddenly, that old story, the one Chris Dawson had told, began to fall apart. This is the story of Lynette Joy Dawson, the woman who vanished, the man who was supposed to love her, and the decades-long fight to uncover the truth. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. What do you think happened to Lynette? Did she really leave on her own? Or was something else at play? Let me know in the comments below. And now let's go back to where it all started. If you had met Lynette Joy Dawson before 1982, you might have described her as warm, kind-hearted, and full of life. Born in 1948 in Australia, she was the kind of person who made people feel at ease, always smiling, always ready to lend a hand. She grew up in a loving family, surrounded by parents who instilled in her the values of loyalty, dedication, and family above all else. From an early age, it was clear Lynette wasn't just someone who loved deeply. She was someone who lived for those she loved. And then at just 16 years old, she met the boy who would change the course of her life. Chris Dawson. Tall, athletic, charismatic. He was a star on the rugby field, a golden boy with charm to spare. He and his identical twin brother, Paul, were inseparable, both destined for the kind of success that came with talent and confidence. And for Lynette, it was as if the universe had aligned. She had found the one, the person she believed she would spend forever with. Their romance moved fast, as young love often does. The kind of love that feels untouchable, that convinces you that nothing can go wrong. By 1970, they were standing at the altar in St. Jude's Church in Randwick, Sydney, exchanging vows, promising each other a lifetime. They were young in love and ready to build a future together. And for a while they did. Marriage brought stability. The arrival of their 2 daughters, Chanel and Sharon, made them a family. Lynette embraced motherhood with the same warmth she had carried all her life. Loving, attentive, devoted. By all outward appearances, the Dawsons had everything. A beautiful home. A stable life. 2 little girls who adored their mother. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Small at first. Almost invisible. The kind of cracks that people dismiss, ignore, or brush aside. Because what Lynette didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man she had promised her life to was not the man she thought he was. And soon those cracks? They would break everything apart. When you look at the early years of Chris Dawson's life, you begin to understand why he seemed like the perfect match for Lynette. He was everything you'd expect from a young man on the rise. Born with athletic ability, charisma, and ambition, Chris had all the traits that made him stand out, especially when it came to rugby. As a young man, Chris Dawson was a force on the rugby field. He played for the Newtown Jets between 1972 and 1976, and during those years, he became a household name. His skills were undeniable. His speed, strength, and agility made him an asset to the team. His presence on the field was magnetic, and those who watched him couldn't help but admire him. But as much as he was admired for his athletic prowess, there was always something about Chris that was more complex than just a sports star. It wasn't just the game that defined him, it was the way he carried himself off the field. The same confidence that made him a standout on the rugby field translated seamlessly into other areas of his life. Chris was a man who seemed to know what he wanted, and for a time seemed to get it. But rugby would eventually take a back seat. Like many athletes, Chris's career in the sport came to an end, and he had to pivot, searching for new avenues where his talents could shine. This led him to the classroom. In the late 1970s, after his rugby career had concluded, Chris transitioned into a teaching career, becoming a physical education teacher at Cromer High School, just outside of Sydney. It seemed like a natural move. His background in sports made him an ideal candidate for the role. At Cromer High, he quickly gained a reputation as a teacher who commanded respect. He was well-liked by students, known for his easygoing demeanor, his athleticism, and his ability to relate to young people. But it wasn't just his professional success that drew attention. Chris's personal life was another matter entirely. You see, Chris Dawson wasn't just any teacher at Cromer High. He had his twin brother, Paul, by his side. Paul Dawson was Chris's mirror image in many ways. Same looks, same confidence, and a similarly easygoing charm. The two brothers were inseparable, and their bond was undeniable. From the outside, it seemed like the kind of brotherly relationship that everyone would envy. But there was something about the way Chris and Paul interacted that would later raise questions. The closeness of their relationship went beyond that of just brothers. It was a dependence, a reliance on each other that was unusual. And while their connection was the source of some admiration, there were whispers. How close was too close? It's important to understand this relationship, this brotherly bond, because it would soon be tested in ways that none of them could have anticipated. As Chris continued to build his life and career, the lines between family, friendship, and even professional boundaries were about to blur. The arrival of a young student at Cromer High would soon begin to unravel everything. But before that, Chris Dawson was living a life that, from the outside, seemed enviable. He had the job, the twin brother, the wife, the two daughters. It was a picture-perfect life, built on a foundation of success, both in his career and in his personal life. Or so it seemed. As much as life seemed to unfold perfectly for Chris Dawson, there were hidden dynamics, quiet undercurrents that most people never saw. One of those undercurrents began to take form at Cromer High School, where Chris Dawson's world was about to collide with something dark and unsettling. It began innocently enough, or so it seemed. A teacher, his students, the usual dynamic of high school life. But things were far from normal for Chris Dawson when he crossed paths with Joanne Curtis, a 16-year-old student. Joanne, much younger than him, seemed to be a world away from his usual circle of colleagues and acquaintances. She wasn't like the other students. She was quiet, reserved, and somewhat of a loner. Yet, for reasons known only to him, Chris began to take an interest in her. At first, it was a relationship between a teacher and a student, guiding her in sports, offering her encouragement. But that professional line soon began to blur, and what had started as a mentorship became something else entirely. Joanne Curtis, just a teenager, soon found herself at the center of an inappropriate relationship with Chris Dawson. As the days and weeks passed, their connection deepened in ways that made many uncomfortable. It wasn't just the fact that Chris, a married man, was getting closer to one of his students. It was the growing secrecy surrounding it. There were rumors, whispers among the staff at Cromer High. Some of Chris's colleagues began to notice the way he acted around Joanne. How he would spend extra time with her, how he would be visibly protective, and how their interactions seemed more than just teacher-student. But no one could prove anything. Meanwhile, back at the Dawson family home, Lynette was living with the growing weight of an unspoken truth. She knew something was off. She could feel it, the subtle changes in Chris's behavior, the way he seemed distant, the way he became absorbed in his work, the way he would talk about Joanne almost too often, as if she were someone much more important than just a student. The cracks in their marriage deepened. Lynette, ever the devoted mother and wife, tried to hold it together for her children, for her family. But Chris's distance was becoming more and more evident. He was not the man she had married, the man she had built a life with. He was changing. And it wasn't just a matter of time. Something was wrong, something was happening beneath the surface, and Lynette couldn't ignore it any longer. On January 8, 1982, Lynette spoke with her mother, making plans to meet the following day at Northbridge Baths. She was looking forward to it, eager to see her mother as they had planned. But she never showed up. And with that, everything changed. Chris Dawson didn't report his wife's disappearance immediately. 6 weeks passed before he even contacted the authorities. 6 weeks. Think about that. A wife, a mother of 2 daughters, disappears without a trace, and her husband waits over a month before making any effort to report it. In those 6 weeks, Chris would give conflicting reasons for Lynette's absence. He suggested she had left because of marital issues, something to do with her spending habits. He even implied she might have joined a religious group. But none of it made sense. What didn't make sense to the people who knew Lynette, what didn't sit right, was that Lynette had no history of running away. No pattern of unexplained disappearances. She wasn't someone who would abandon her children or her life, not without a word. It was right after Lynette's disappearance that Joanne Curtis moved into the Dawson home. And just like that, the pieces began to fall into place. Lynette was gone, and in her place was someone who had no business being there. Someone who had played a much larger role in the unraveling of the Dawson family than anyone had realized. Chris Dawson's world had changed. The family he had once been so devoted to was no longer the center of his life. And while Lynette was missing, Chris was already building a new life with someone else. In 1984, he would marry Joanne Curtis, his former student. But in the years that followed, the world would demand answers. Answers that would take decades to come. Answers that, when they finally arrived, would unravel the mystery of what really happened to Lynette Dawson. And yet, even now, after all these years, there remains one glaring truth that still hasn't been answered. Where is Lynette Dawson? What happened to her? Stay with me. The story isn't over yet. We're just getting started. It was January 8, 1982, when Lynette Dawson spoke with her mother, making plans to meet her the next day at Northbridge Baths. The conversation was normal, even mundane, filled with the kind of promises that families make. But Lynette never showed up. That was the last time anyone would hear from Lynette Dawson. She vanished without a trace. For the next 6 weeks, her husband, Chris Dawson, remained silent. He didn't report his wife missing. In fact, it wasn't until February, 6 weeks after Lynette's disappearance, that Chris contacted the police. Why the delay? Why wait so long to report the woman who had shared your life, your children, your home? When he finally did speak to the authorities, his explanations were bizarre, inconsistent. According to Chris, Lynette had left, fleeing from their marital issues, her financial troubles, and her alleged obsession with spending. He suggested that she had taken off to join a religious group, something he claimed had been on her mind for a while. But here's the thing. Nothing about that made sense. Lynette was a devoted mother, a woman who had no history of running away or abandoning her family. She had no history of mental health issues or any reason to flee her life. The idea that she had simply walked away without a word to anyone seemed implausible. It gets worse when you consider the timing. Immediately after Lynette disappeared, Joanne Curtis, the 16-year-old student with whom Chris had been involved, moved into the Dawson family home. It was as if nothing had changed. Life moved on for Chris, and yet the world was left to wonder what had really happened to Lynette. What do you think? Do you believe Chris's explanation of his wife's disappearance? Could she have really just left as he claimed? Or was something far darker at play? Despite the suspicions swirling around Chris Dawson and the odd circumstances surrounding Lynette's disappearance, the investigation into her case faced significant obstacles. The police had no body, no direct evidence, and no clear suspect. But that didn't stop the search for answers. In 2001, a coronial inquest was held to determine the cause of Lynette's disappearance. The coroner concluded that Lynette was likely murdered by someone she knew, though the exact circumstances remained unclear. A second inquest followed in 2003, and the findings were much the same. Lynette Dawson's death was not accidental, and the evidence pointed to foul play. Yet, despite these conclusions, no charges were brought against Chris Dawson. The evidence at the time was circumstantial. Without a body, a murder weapon, or any direct proof linking Chris to Lynette's death, investigators were unable to build a solid case. It seemed like a dead end, but the lack of closure didn't stop the questions. How could a man be allowed to walk free with so much pointing toward his involvement in his wife's disappearance? How could a life be taken? And yet, for years, there was no justice. The case of Lynette Dawson would lay dormant for over a decade, with few developments and no clear path forward. But even with the lack of a body or concrete evidence, the pursuit of justice for Lynette would eventually be reignited. In 2018, a podcast would change everything. The Teacher's Pet, created by journalist Hedley Thomas, renewed public interest in the case of Lynette Dawson's disappearance. Hedley, known for his investigative work, took a deep dive into the unresolved mystery, uncovering details that had previously been overlooked or dismissed. The podcast explored the relationship between Chris Dawson and Joanne Curtis, the questions around Lynette's disappearance, and the growing suspicion surrounding Chris. It was more than just a rehash of old facts. It was an investigation in itself. The podcast meticulously examined witness testimonies, the timeline of events, and even Chris's past behavior. The Teacher's Pet quickly gained traction. It became a sensation, attracting millions of listeners worldwide. People became obsessed with the story, and the renewed public attention put pressure on law enforcement. As the podcast reached its peak, new evidence started to surface, and the once dismissed case was thrust back into the spotlight. The power of media was undeniable. Hedley Thomas's podcast played a crucial role in not only bringing new eyes to the case, but also in pushing for accountability. With the case now a national topic of conversation, Chris Dawson's fate seemed inevitable. As the podcast's popularity grew, so did the public's demand for justice for Lynette. The case, once dormant, had found new life, and soon, so would the investigation. In December 2018, after decades of silence and uncertainty, Chris Dawson was arrested. The arrest came after years of pressure, fueled by the overwhelming impact of the Teacher's Pet podcast and the resurgence of public interest in Lynette's case. For many, this moment felt like the start of justice for Lynette Dawson, even if it had taken far too long. The legal proceedings were intense. In 2022, Chris stood trial for the murder of his wife. The courtroom was filled with the weight of decades of unanswered questions, but the prosecution finally had the evidence they needed. Key testimonies from witnesses, including former students and colleagues, painted a disturbing picture of Chris's relationship with Joanne Curtis and his behavior leading up to Lynette's disappearance. Perhaps most damning was the fact that Chris had provided inconsistent explanations for Lynette's sudden disappearance. His claims, her leaving due to marital issues, his suggestion that she had joined a religious group, were no longer seen as plausible. The judge dismissed the idea that Lynette had voluntarily abandoned her family. The timeline, the behavior of both Chris and Joanne, and the circumstantial evidence pointed squarely at Chris as the person responsible for Lynette's death. In August 2022, after deliberations, Chris Dawson was found guilty of murder. The judge, having reviewed all the evidence, concluded that the possibility of Lynette voluntarily leaving her family was far-fetched. The compelling evidence of Dawson's involvement in her disappearance and death led to the conviction. Chris Dawson was sentenced to 24 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 18 years. For Lynette's family, the conviction brought some closure, but the haunting question of where Lynette's body lies remains unanswered. Though Chris Dawson's fate was sealed, the story of Lynette's disappearance serves as a powerful reminder of how the truth, no matter how long buried, will always find its way to the surface. In December 2022, Chris Dawson was sentenced to 24 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 18 years. For Lynette's family, the sentence brought a sense of justice, but it could never bring Lynette back. The conviction was a hard-earned victory after decades of doubt, silence, and public speculation. But while the legal system had delivered its verdict, the questions surrounding Lynette's disappearance, especially the mystery of her body, lingered. Chris Dawson, however, was far from done. He appealed the conviction, hoping for a chance at freedom. His legal team argued against the judge's findings, claiming there were errors in the trial's proceedings. But the appeal was rejected. The court upheld the conviction, reinforcing the belief that justice had finally been served. As if the murder conviction wasn't enough, Chris faced another blow. In addition to the sentence for Lynette's murder, Dawson was handed an extra 3 years for his unlawful sexual relationship with a student, Joanne Curtis, during the time he was married to Lynette. This added sentence only compounded the severity of his actions and the damage done to those he betrayed. The aftermath of Lynette Dawson's case continues to echo. Her family, while satisfied with the conviction, still yearns for closure, the truth about what truly happened to her and the whereabouts of her remains. And Chris Dawson, though behind bars, has become a symbol of how long-buried secrets can be unearthed, no matter how much time has passed. Despite the conviction, one haunting mystery remains unsolved. Lynette Dawson's body has never been found. Her family continues to plead for information, hoping for a final piece of closure that has long evaded them. Where is she? What happened to her remains? This question lingers in the minds of those who followed the case and will likely never fade for her daughters, Chanel and Sharon, who have never been able to lay their mother to rest. The absence of Lynette's body has sparked broader discussions about missing persons cases and how they're handled by the authorities. Could things have been different if there had been more immediate action taken when she first disappeared? How many other cases remain unresolved, simply because there's no body to confirm the worst fears? Lynette's case calls attention to the flaws and challenges within the system, and there are calls for legal reforms to ensure that cases like hers receive the urgency and attention they deserve. The public impact of this case is undeniable. It has raised awareness about the importance of media in criminal investigations and how investigative journalism can serve as a catalyst for long overdue justice. The Teacher's Pet podcast was instrumental in reawakening interest in the case, demonstrating just how much the power of public attention can shape the outcome of a case. As we reflect on Lynette Dawson's story, I ask you to think about the unresolved aspects, the truth of her disappearance, the impact on her family, and how this case continues to reverberate through the years. What are your thoughts on the unanswered questions that still remain? In today's video, We've explored the tragic and unsettling story of Lynette Dawson, her disappearance in 1982, the enduring mystery surrounding her fate, and the eventual conviction of her husband, Chris Dawson, for her murder. From their early life together, to the investigation that spanned decades, and the pivotal role of The Teacher's Pet podcast in reviving the case, we've seen how time and public interest can alter the course of justice. Yet, despite Chris Dawson's conviction, there's one haunting question that remains. Where is Lynette's body? Her family continues their search for answers, and we are left to reflect on the unresolved aspects of this case. The impact on the public, the role of the media, and the lessons learned about missing persons investigations are all crucial takeaways. I invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of the case? Do you believe all the questions have been answered? And if you have any additional information or perspectives on the case, we'd love to hear them. If you found this story gripping, be sure to check out our other content on similar true crime cases. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on more in-depth investigations and stories that challenge the boundaries of justice. If you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. And let's keep the conversation going. What do you think really happened to Lynette Dawson? Share your thoughts in the comments below.